Товарищи, рабоче-крестьянская революция, о необходимости которой все время говорили большевики, совершилась!
The seeds of civil war had been laid in Russia far before the events of 1917. The already troubled empire was plunged into even greater instability as she entered the Great War. The mounting casualties at the front and the worsening economic situation in the rear exacerbated already existing tensions between the various social classes and ethnic groups that made up the Russian Empire. These issues culminated in the February Revolution of 1917, overthrowing Tsar Nicholas and concluding with the transfer of power to a provisional government. But change was not immediately brought by the overthrow of the Tsar. The provisional government, headed by Prince Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky, lacked any real authority, and meaningful changes could only occur after a constituent assembly had been elected. On top of that, the provisional government often had to compete for power against assemblies of workers, soldiers, and peasants called Soviets. The Soviets were initially dominated by moderate socialist factions such as the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries of the Right. But as they too failed to enact change, they began to lose influence in favor of the radical left, dominated by the Bolsheviks of Vladimir Lenin. Radicalized at a young age, Lenin dedicated most of his adult life to the revolution and to bringing upon the dictatorship of the proletariat. Upon returning to Russia, Lenin was gifted with the perfect opportunity for his vision of the revolution to come true. During a particularly controversial event in September, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, General Lev Kornilov, marched on the Petrograd believing that the Bolsheviks had taken the provisional government hostage. He was accused by Kerensky as a traitor, and both sides were on the brink of a violent confrontation. It was only thanks to the Bolshevik Red Guards that Kornilov's men were convinced to surrender. Kornilov, along with several other officers, including Anton Denikin, were interned in the Baikov Monastery. The Kornilov affair was arguably the last nail in the coffin for the provisional government. Kerensky, and what little supporters he had, grew weaker, as Lenin grew ever so stronger. On October 25th, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd and Moscow in what is dubbed the October Revolution. The seizure of power was strongly opposed by the conservative elements of Russian society. The lines between combatants were drawn between Red Guards, sailors, and revolutionary soldiers on the side of the Bolsheviks, and Cossacks, officers, and officer cadets on the side of the counter-revolution. Lenin was successful in his coup, and over the following months, Bolshevik control slowly spread across Russia. Lenin found allies in the left SRs, with several of them taking important positions in his government and within the Cheka. The Mensheviks and the SRs of the right were, for now, unwilling to take up arms against the Bolsheviks, instead opting for passive resistance or simply tolerating the new regime. As for the liberal KPD, they were simply too small and too weak to offer any significant opposition. Because of the rivals' lack of support and unwillingness to fight, Lenin was able to consolidate his control over most of Russia, specifically the cities. The last meaningful threat to Lenin's power was the election of the Constituent Assembly, which was viewed by most as being the legitimate authority in Russia. The Bolsheviks performed well in the major cities of Petrograd and Moscow, but only received 25% of the total votes. The Socialist Revolutionaries, both right and left branches, received between 39 and 45%, making them the largest party within the assembly. What this meant for Lenin was that control over Russia would be heavily disputed if the assembly was to remain open. After its first session on January 5th, the Bolshevik Central Committee issued a decree that permanently closed the Constituent Assembly. The last chance to resist the Bolsheviks via peaceful methods had been lost. Not only that, but the infamous Cheka began cracking down on dissent. Now, the only way to overthrow the Bolsheviks was via arms. Luckily for Lenin, armed resistance temporarily ceased after the Bolshevik takeover, but the foundations for what would become the White Armies had already been laid. Shortly after Kornilov's incarceration, the new commander-in-chief, General Alexeyev, was in communication with the so-called Baikov generals about establishing an officer volunteer organization to continue the war against Germany and to restore order to Russia. Officers and officer cadets from Petrograd and Moscow, many of which had resisted the October Revolution, were recruited by Alexeyev for this cause. On October 30th, after failing to defeat the Bolsheviks, what was called the Alexeyev Organization was ordered to flee south to the city of Novotcherkassk, the capital of the Don. General Dukhonin, Alexeyev's replacement as head of the army, facilitated the escape of the Baikov generals, and they themselves headed south to join Alexeyev. Unfortunately for him, Dukhonin couldn't save his own life, as he was lynched by a mob just as his replacement arrived at the Russian army's Stavka. Most of the Baikov generals disguised themselves as to not draw attention during their escape, but Kornilov was different. Instead, he reunited with soldiers loyal to him and marched south on foot. They were eventually spotted by a Bolshevik armored train and fought a brief skirmish in which Kornilov was himself almost killed. What remained of his soldiers were too demoralized to carry on, and Kornilov was forced to complete the journey on his own. The first officers arrived in Novocherkassk on November 2nd, and were soon joined by other members of the anti-Bolshevik camp. With that, what historian Jonathan Smell calls the heart and soul of the White Cause had been established: the Volunteer Army. The Volunteer Army wasn't the only group that opposed the Bolsheviks. Only a day after the October Revolution, the Orenburg Cossack host, led by Ataman Dutov, revolted against the Orenburg Soviet and took over the city. On November 18th, the infamous Cossack warlord Grigory Semyonov clashed with Bolshevik forces in the far east, and on December 2nd, the Don Cossacks seized control of Rostov-on-Don and other cities from the Bolsheviks. The Cossacks were a privileged social class within the Russian Empire that had faithfully served the Tsars for years. Unwilling to give up their social status, they formed the Iron Fist of the counter-revolution, and seemingly made for natural allies with the Whites. However, it would take quite a struggle to convince them to join their side. Ataman Kaledin of the Don Cossacks had declared independence from Russia on November 20th, and were preoccupied first and foremost with the defense of the Don. Kaledin welcomed the Volunteer Army, hoping that they could further his objective, but many other Cossacks believed that the volunteers would only attract the attention of the Bolsheviks. Despite the independence of the Don, Bolshevik influence in the region had not disappeared. The sizable non-Cossack population largely preferred them to Kaledin, and the younger Cossacks, exhausted from war and radicalized at the front, refused to take sides and went home. The periphery of the old Russian Empire had yet to be completely subjugated, and posed a serious threat to the triumphal march of Soviet power. The march itself was completed in February 1918, after Vladivostok and the areas around Lake Baikal had mostly come under Bolshevik control, but it would take a much larger campaign to seize the rest. During what was called the Railway War, thousands of revolutionary troops from Petrograd and other Bolshevik strongholds set out in trains across all of Russia. The smaller Cossack hosts of the Terek and in Siberia posed no immediate threat. The Bolsheviks set their sights on the Don, the resource-rich Ukraine, and on the city of Orenburg that severed the line with Turkestan and central Russia. The prominent Bolshevik Antonov Ovseyenko, who'd commanded the Red Guards against the Cossacks of Peter Krasnov during the fighting in Petrograd, was put in charge of the newly established Southern Front base in Kharkiv. He himself was to focus on the Don Cossacks, whilst his underling, the World War I veteran Mikhail Muravyev, was to go against the Ukrainian Rada. Antonov's forces arrived in the Don in force around early December. The First Army, led by Yuri Savlin, entered from the north towards Novocherkassk, while the Second Army, led by Rudolf Sivers, advanced from the Donbass in the west, with their sights on Rostov. Ataman Kaledin called upon Alexeyev and Kornilov to support, as many of his own Cossacks refused to fight. By now, the Volunteer Army numbered only 500 men and struggled to fend off the Red Guards. The Bolsheviks seized Rostov around the beginning of December and were able to threaten Novocherkassk, but the Volunteer Army launched a successful counterattack and retook the city. To quote historian Antony Bever, "For many, this was the action that inaugurated the Civil War." Due to the small size of both armies and the expanse of the battlefields, there were no front lines between combatants. Instead, skirmishes were almost exclusively fought along the rail lines, and even then, both sides preferred to withdraw rather than fight. If prisoners were taken, torture and death was to be expected. Though in its infancy, the Russian Civil War was to be a brutal conflict with little mercy given by either side. At the rear of the Whites, the Bolshevik workers of Taganrog revolted on January 14. They were poorly armed but numerically superior, engaging the minuscule volunteer garrison in brutal street fighting. Being completely outmatched, the volunteers surrendered to the Reds under the promise that they'd be given safe passage out of the city, but were betrayed and slaughtered like animals. The forces of the Ukrainian Rada only numbered 20,000 troops, most of them being Free Cossacks led by General Simon Petlera, as most Ukrainian troops from the Russian army deserted and went home. Muravyev had a mixed force of 30,000 Red Guards from the Bolshevik-backed Ukrainian Soviet Republic and from Russia. The Reds first conquered the Ukrainian city of Poltava, where they executed all officers that they could get their hands on. On January 15th, Red forces reached the Dnieper River, just outside of Kyiv, and commenced their bombardment of the city. The Russian officers who had taken refuge in Kiev had remained passive, not wanting to fight for the red of the Bolsheviks or the blue and yellow of Ukraine. The Ukrainian defenders were reduced to a small and battered force, and the Rada was forced to flee. The passivity of the Russian officers did little to save them, and they became victims of Bolshevik reprisals along with countless others. Officers were killed without mercy, and the Reds engaged in a brutal spree of pillage and destruction. In total, 5,000 people were murdered, and the remainder of the population was left terrified. The non-Cossack population of Orenburg heavily opposed Ataman Dutov's takeover, sympathizing with the Bolsheviks. Just like with Kalydin, the younger Cossacks of the Orenburg were unwilling to fight, leaving Dutov with a limited force to fend off the Reds. The invading Bolsheviks easily overwhelmed the defenders, retaking Orenburg on July 31st and pushing what remained of the Orenburg Cossack host into the Kyrgyz steppe. The volunteer army managed to hold its ground during the first few days of the Russian Civil War. By late January, the ranks had grown to 3,000 troops, though many officers who had fled south still refused to join. This surge in recruits was largely thanks to the charismatic Kornilov, whose inspiring example encouraged many to join, but the situation was still far from desirable. Firstly, the volunteer army was incapable of winning over the local population of the territories they controlled, and few rank-and-file soldiers enlisted. It was an army of officers, without any soldiers to command, and disputes broke out over who was supposed to be in charge. Secondly, Kornilov and Alexeyev didn't get along and argued over leadership. Kornilov insisted that he be made commander-in-chief under threat of leaving for Siberia, and had a disdain for Pavel Milyukov and his cadets. It was ultimately decided that Kornilov would take command of the volunteer army, while Alexeyev would be in charge of political and financial tasks. However, in practice, this agreement didn't always work, and the two men kept butting heads. All this fighting did was weaken the volunteers from within. The Bolshevik advance resumed, and they penetrated the north of the Kuban, threatening the rear of the volunteers. Against the pleas of Kalydin, both Kornilov and Alexeyev agreed that if they were to survive, they'd have no other choice but to flee south. Rostov and Novocherkassk were vulnerable, and what few Cossacks were available to defend the cities were eliminated or deserted. On January 29th, Ataman Kalydin announced to his government that there was nothing left to discuss. He proceeded to enter the adjacent room and shot himself in the heart. He was replaced by General Anatoly Nazarov, who was just as incapable of turning around their misfortunes. He came to the same conclusion as the volunteers and ordered his men to retreat, but Nazarov refused to abandon Rostov. On February 23rd, when the Bolsheviks took the city, he was captured, and 2 days later, was executed. Novocherkassk fell to the Bolsheviks the same day as Rostov, and the volunteers had no choice but to march south under harsh winter conditions to the Kuban, all the while being pursued by hostile forces. The Whites numbered about 3,700 troops. Accompanying them were around 1,000 civilians who feared reprisals from the Bolsheviks. Everything from food to cannons had to be dragged on carts that slowed the march down to a crawl, all the while 100,000 disorganized Red Guards gave chase. The volunteer army set its sights on the city of Ekaterinodar, the capital of the Kuban. The Kuban Cossack host was around the same size of the Don Cossacks, but lacked a firm leader to properly organize anti-Bolshevik resistance. Whilst protected by the mountains to the south and the Don to the north, they were soon beset upon by the Bolsheviks, and, on March 13th, their leaders were forced to flee the capital. The volunteers were initially successful in avoiding the overwhelming enemy force, but on March 6th, in the village of Lysanka, Markov's regiment was caught off guard by an overwhelming force that nearly destroyed them. Luckily for them, the volunteers managed to flee, maneuvering around the flank of the disorganized Red Guards. Lysanka was also the site of a vicious war crime perpetrated by the volunteers just before the Bolsheviks arrived. Villagers were known for their pro-Bolshevik sympathies, and, also in reprisal for Bolshevik atrocities, the volunteers murdered 60 unarmed villagers in cold blood. One of the volunteers, named Roman Gul, contemplated the slaughter in horror, and wondered to himself if the Whites were any better than the Reds. The largest battle occurred in the town of Kurenskaya over the course of 4 days. Kornilov believed the town to be defended by a minuscule force of Red Guards, but when the volunteers arrived, they were confronted by 10,000 defenders. In a dangerous gamble, Kornilov took the risk and engaged with his exhausted troops. After suffering 400 casualties, the volunteers beat the odds and seized the town on the 17th, and with it, much needed supplies. It was around this time that they learned of the fall of Ekaterinodar, and questions arose on what they should do next. Against the wishes of Kornilov, Alexeyev and General Anton Denikin pressed for a continued advance on the capital of the Kuban. By this point, the volunteer army had fought 40 battles and were exhausted. But to their rescue came the Kuban Cossacks, led by Ataman Filimanov and General Pokrovsky, strengthening the White forces to 6,000 soldiers. The atrocities committed by Bolshevik troops essentially forced the Kuban Cossacks to side with the volunteers. Hidden weapons were distributed, and more Cossacks took to their horses in the defense of their homeland, and provided the Whites with much-needed cavalry. The White forces made quick progress towards Ekaterinodar, and were expecting the city to be garrisoned by only 18,000 Bolsheviks. On April 11th, the fight for the city commenced, when, due to poor communication, Markov's regiment crossed the river straight into Bolshevik positions. The Reds were much more numerous than expected, and well dug in, holding their ground in a bloody battle that inflicted heavy losses on both sides. The Whites were forced to fall back and rest. Alexeyev and Denikin seemingly changed their minds about taking Ekaterinodar and wanted to withdraw so that they could properly recover. But Kornilov also changed his mind and urged the attack to continue, setting up his command post in a barn close to the front, planning the next assault. Unluckily for Kornilov, on the 13th, his command post was hit by enemy artillery, and he was killed. After suffering the loss of hundreds of men and their symbolic leader, the attack was called off, and the Whites retreated into the steppe. Even in death, Kornilov once again fell victim to the Reds as he was dug out of his grave and his body was desecrated. Anton Denikin was appointed as Kornilov's replacement. For as hard on morale as Kornilov's death was, it quite possibly was a blessing in disguise. Aside from getting along better with Denikin, Alexeyev had little faith that the White movement could have survived under the leadership of the brave but stupid and arrogant Kornilov. The Reds were too busy desecrating Kornilov's body to pursue the fleeing Whites, and Denikin managed to slip away north back towards the Don. The Whites were half destroyed, dragging behind them countless wounded men in carts. Leaving them behind was the equivalent to a death sentence, as they, just like the Bolsheviks, had murdered countless prisoners without mercy. However, if they were to escape, hundreds of injured men had to be abandoned, either succumbing to their wounds or being finished off by the Reds. Despite the ice march of the volunteer army ending in defeat, the volunteers set an example for others contemplating resistance against the Bolsheviks and, most importantly, survived to fight another day. The war had died down as the Central Powers stood by and watched as Russia was consumed by chaos. The war was at the core of the issues plaguing Russia, and Lenin knew for a fact that if he wanted to hang on to power, he'd have to bring the war to a quick end. On October 26, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, under pressure from the Bolsheviks, approved the Decree on Peace. The Workers' and Peasants' Government calls upon the belligerent peoples and their governments to start immediate negotiations for a just, democratic peace, an immediate peace without annexations, i.e. without the seizure of lands, without the forcible incorporation of foreign nations, and without indemnities. The decree had the immediate effect of winning over the support of the soldiers, but implementing an immediate peace without annexations and without indemnities was a whole other task to accomplish. Not only were the Germans unlikely to accept such demands, but the Russian army, needed to force such demands, was being dismantled by the Bolsheviks. Ensign Krylenko, the new Bolshevik commander-in-chief of the Russian army, set about destroying the army with decrees that democratized units and demobilized soldiers. On January 29, 1918, the whole Russian army was officially demobilized. The belief was that if the Germans advanced deeper into Russia, the masses of workers and peasants would form militias, taking up arms against the invaders in a so-called revolutionary war. Lenin was convinced that the decree on peace would encourage the workers of the world to rise in support of the revolution before Russia could be conquered. On the 13th of November, Leon Trotsky contacted the German High Command and requested that peace talks commence. Leon Trotsky, a former Menshevik, was arguably Lenin's greatest subordinate. He was both smart and charismatic, a talented speaker, and an excellent organizer. If you were to find yourself in Lenin's position, you'd probably want someone like him. On the 16th, the Soviet delegation set off from Petrograd to the German headquarters in Brest-Litovsk. The delegation was headed by the prominent Bolsheviks Adolf Joff, Lev Kamenev, and Lev Karajan. The Bolsheviks attempted to negotiate a 6-month armistice between them and the Central Powers, stalling for time until the workers of the world rose up in defense of the revolution. But they couldn't make these demands and were forced to sign a month-long armistice on December 2nd. With things not going his way, Lenin replaced Joff as head of the delegation for Trotsky, hoping that he'd be able to waste more of Germany's time, and waste their time he did. Trotsky, as mentioned, was very charismatic and also fluent in German. He was able to redirect talks regarding peace terms to discussions on philosophy. The head of the German delegation, Baron Kuhlmann, was especially susceptible to Trotsky's games, and both men spent hours on end talking about philosophy. But the Germans eventually grew tired of playing. General Erich von Ludendorff and General Hindenburg had had enough. Ludendorff wanted to transfer German troops from the east to the west in anticipation for the final showdown with the Entente, and pressured Kuhlmann to be firm against Trotsky. They demanded that the Bolsheviks cede all territory that the Central Powers held. While these terms were harsh, there really wasn't anything the Bolsheviks could do about it. Trotsky then returned to Petrograd to discuss with Lenin and the Central Committee on whether Germany's terms should be accepted. Nikolai Bujarin's faction were in favor of rejecting the peace with Germany, believing that the Red Guards could wage a revolutionary war till chaos broke out in the West. Trotsky's group had little faith that the Red Guards had a chance of winning, but instead of suing for peace, they proposed wasting more of Germany's time, under the slogan of "No peace, no war." Lenin was in accordance with Trotsky on the futility of revolutionary war, but feared that without a proper army, there'd be no holding the Germans back. But Lenin and his supporters were in the minority. Not having any better option, he was forced to align himself with Trotsky. On January 11th, a resolution was approved after a vote. Trotsky got his way and returned to Brest-Litovsk to deliver the news to the Germans. When there, he announced to them that Russia would withdraw from the war without signing any sort of peace, much to the bewilderness of the Germans. But after their initial confusion, they made it clear to Trotsky that they were done playing games and demanded that Russia accept their demands. To make matters worse, the Ukrainian Rada, or what was left of it, signed their own peace deal with the Germans on February 9th, further weakening the position of the Bolsheviks. On the 16th, the Bolsheviks were given an ultimatum that, if not signed, hostilities would resume. On the morning of the 18th, the Germans resumed their invasion and advanced all along the front, the Bolsheviks offering little in the way of resistance. In Ukraine, the Central Powers, along with their new allies, made quick work of the enemy. The first city to fall was Dvinsk. There, the Red Guards made a futile attempt to hold their ground. The very next day, Trotsky realized that perhaps Lenin was right after all, and the two sent a telegram to the German commander, General Hoffmann, that they would accept his conditions. After reporting to Ludendorff, Hoffmann was ordered to stall, as to let the offensive seize as much land as possible. What has been called the 11 Days War was less of a war and more of a contest of who could run east quickest. To quote General Hoffmann, "This is the most comical war I have ever seen. We put a handful of infantrymen with machine guns and a cannon on a train and rush them to the next station. They capture it, take a few Bolsheviks prisoner, pick up a few more soldiers, and so on. This proceeding has, at any rate, the charm of novelty." In accordance with Revolutionary War, the Bolsheviks tried to raise local militias to stave off the German advance. However, all of these failed, and the only forces available were those of Antonov Ovseyenko, who only had 10,000 mobile troops to counter the enemy advance. One after another, Soviet cities began to fall to the Germans. The Bolsheviks were given new demands, this time much harsher. Lenin put his entire reputation on the line, threatening that if the demands weren't accepted, that he'd resign from the Central Committee and from the Sovnarkom. Given the current situation, the Bolsheviks had no other choice, and, on the 23rd, accepted to what amounted to defeat. On March 3rd, the Bolsheviks and the Central Powers signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, bringing closure to the Eastern Front and any delusions of revolutionary warfare. In summary, the treaty stated that Russia was to give up Poland, Ukraine, the Baltics, and the southern Transcaucasia, while also demobilizing their entire army. Not to mention, the Germans also involved themselves in the Finnish Civil War, on the side of the White Guards. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and Russia's subjugation by the Germans was a massive humiliation for the Bolsheviks, having lost some of their best farmland, countless factories, natural resources, and millions of people. The debate amongst the Bolsheviks on whether they should have accepted Germany's terms almost resulted in a split in the party. Yet, the revolution was saved from immediate destruction, and Lenin's promise of peace was finally realized. Of the many consequences of Russia's defeat, three of its most immediate was the evacuation of the Bolshevik government from Petrograd to Moscow, the second was the demission of the left SRs from Lenin's government in protest of the treaty, and the third was the weakening of Bolshevik forces in the recently captured Don, giving the local Cossacks the perfect chance to revolt and re-establish their independence. General Peter Krasnov, the man who had tried to take Petrograd back in October, had made his way back to the Don. The Bolshevik occupation, while brief, had been incredibly brutal against the Cossack population. The newly established Don Soviet Republic unleashed a reign of terror, requisitioning grain at gunpoint and executing hundreds of hostages. The Bolshevik forces retreating from Ukraine briefly passed through the region and raided Cossack villages. The Bolsheviks did what Kaledin had failed to do, turn the Cossacks against the Reds. Around Novotcherkassk, Cossack militias began to form for an eventual uprising against the Reds. Every stanitsa formed their own armies of insurgents and began planning the liberation of their capital. By the end of April, the Don Cossacks had gathered a force of 10,000 riders, poised to attack at the perfect moment. When the Germans were about to arrive, the Cossacks marched on Novocherkassk and took the city without a fight. A new Krug, which was an assembly of Cossacks, was formed, and they elected Peter Krasnov as Ataman of the Don Cossacks. The Germans, viewing the Cossacks as a useful ally, supplied them with weapons in exchange for grain. Krasnov even wrote to Kaiser Wilhelm himself, pleading for German troops to assist them in their fight against the Bolsheviks. Krasnov's ultimate goal was to unite all the Cossack hosts of southern Russia into an independent federation headed by the Don. However, his pro-German sympathies dissuaded many outside of his own host, particularly the Volunteer Army, from trusting him. The liberation of the Don from Bolshevik control was completed between May and early August of 1918, and now Krasnov had his hands free to plan future offensives beyond the Cossack homeland. Russia's defeat in World War I and the Bolsheviks' failure to contend with internal threats made it clear that a proper army was needed if Lenin's regime was going to survive. The only troops of quality the Bolsheviks had at their disposal were, curiously, 20,000 Latvian riflemen commanded by Colonel Jokums Vacitis. Hardened veterans of World War I, Vacitis and his men had been one of the first units to proclaim their support for the Bolsheviks and would be crucial in the battles to come. Leon Trotsky understood the situation better than most, and, despite having no military experience, would be the driving force behind the professionalization and the centralization of the newly created Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. Interestingly, the Red Army was founded not as a tool to fight the counter-revolution, but to fight against the Central Powers, and for its first few months of existence, the Red Army was focused to the west. Even in April, Trotsky believed that the revolution's external enemies posed a much greater threat than those within. This initial purpose aided Trotsky in convincing the more skeptical Bolsheviks into agreeing with them. First and foremost, the command of the Red Army needed to be centralized. Considering that the Bolsheviks had little military experience, Trotsky didn't have anywhere else to look for qualified personnel other than the former officers of the Tsarist army. An emphasis was given on staff officers, needed so that the army could function, and within a few weeks, 8,000 offered their services, being recruited as military specialists. One of Trotsky's most important associates was General Bonch Bruevich, who was the head of the military council. Bruevich had been a staff officer, and his own brother, a veteran Bolshevik, had at one point been Lenin's personal secretary, making him both valuable and reliable. Bonch proved especially capable of convincing other officers to enlist, so much so that the railway coach where he interviewed them was jokingly called the General Trap. It was here that the Red Army's intended goal of fighting the Germans helped convince these men to volunteer. When Bonch asked General Parsky why he wanted to join, Parsky said, quote, "You know, I'm far from this socialism that your Bolsheviks preach, but I am ready to work honorably not only with them, but with anyone, even the devil and his disciples, if only to save Russia from German slavery." Of great help was also the fact that the central administration of the Tsarist army was inherited by the Reds, providing the Red Army with the infrastructure it needed to grow. While the decision to enlist former officers was beneficial, it was not without its consequences. Traditional army discipline was also reinstated, and many felt that it was counterproductive to submit themselves once again to the officers of the old regime. Not only that, but desertion of military specialists was quite common and risked destroying the Red Army from within. To ensure their loyalty, the Bolsheviks took their families hostage under threat of violence, though its usage was rare. Probably the most effective measure was the implementation of political commissars, acting as a sort of supervisor over both military specialists and soldiers alike. For the most part, commissars and commanders tended to work together well, helping each other maintain order within their units. Regardless, many Bolsheviks still didn't see eye to eye with Trotsky's decisions. These individuals included men like Joseph Stalin and went on to form what was called the military opposition, pushing hard for commissars to be given greater responsibility in decision-making and more control for the party. For almost a year, the military opposition was a nasty thorn in Trotsky's side, and he'd just have to deal with them for the time being. Another difficulty facing the Red Army was the issue of recruitment. Based on Bonch's plans, the Red Army was to grow to encompass 1 million men, incorporated into 91 divisions. Recruitment was based on the volunteer principle, believing that hundreds of thousands of workers could be recruited from the cities. But the initial results were pitiful. In Moscow, for example, the Bolsheviks expected 300,000 volunteers to join, but only 20,000 did so. Of the 306,000 volunteers registered on May 10th, many of them were of the lowest dregs of society, while others just joined to get a free gun and uniform before deserting back home. Because of this, compulsory service had to be implemented, which involved recruiting large amounts of peasants. One of the problems with trying to build such a large army was acquiring sufficient supplies. Their control over Central Russia meant that the Bolsheviks inherited the largest stockpiles of weapons from the Tsarist army, allowing them to live off them for the foreseeable future. But finding enough food for all these soldiers was arguably the greatest difficulty, as Russia's ruined economy failed to cope after the loss of its grain-producing regions. Combined with a breakdown in transportation, the Red Army was often forced to live off the land at the expense of the local peasants, adding further challenges as the Bolsheviks lost what little support they had in the countryside. The road to victory was a tough one, and it would take months before the Red Army would be capable of reaching it. Despite their many issues, the Bolsheviks were off to a much better start than their enemies, thanks to their control of Central Russia. The number of men and material available to the Red Army was far greater than what the Whites could muster, and Central Russia's rail network allowed them to redeploy what they had at the start of the war. It would take time for the Red Army to grow and to learn, and for the time being, they would just have to make do with what little they had, even accepting help from unlikely candidates. With the Finnish White Armies and their German allies triumphing in the Finnish Civil War, there was now a potential enemy stationed along Russia's northern border, threatening both Petrograd and Murmansk. Petrograd was a much larger city and better defended from attacks. Murmansk, on the other hand, wasn't. The port of Murmansk had been used by the Allies to deliver supplies to the Russian army. However, its distance from the front and the lack of infrastructure resulted in vast quantities of war material being trapped in the port. The Finns were also actively sending troops across the border, and there was a serious risk that they would attack the port. The British were aware of this and had sent HMS Glory under Rear Admiral Thomas Kemp to protect the harbor. The Murmansk Soviet, headed by Alexei Yuriev, had requested that they be permitted to accept assistance from the British. Trotsky, deeming the British as a lesser threat, told the local Soviet to cooperate. Allied intervention into the Russian Civil War was just fine within the context of the Great War. The Allies sought to prevent Germany from further exploiting Russia, and sought to strengthen other factions to fight against them, even hoping that the Eastern Front could somehow be reopened. An ulterior motive was that they wished to see the hostile Bolshevik government overthrown, even establishing contacts with the Don Cossacks, the Ukrainians, and providing funding to the volunteer army. In early March, a small force of British sailors and Marines landed in Murmansk to bolster the garrison of local Red Guards. Rumors began circulating that the Finnish White Army was marching towards the port. 75 miles northwest to Murmansk was the village of Pechenga that was supposed to be housing a Finnish expedition. On May 3rd, a mixed force of British troops and Bolshevik Red Guards boarded the HMS Cochrane and set off to confront the invaders. With help from local fur traders, they landed and moved inland, setting up camp in a small border town. The first engagement started on the 10th, when a Red Guards outpost along the road was attacked by 200 Finns on skis. The following day, a fishing village had been taken by the Finns, and the Anglo-Soviet counterattack ended in disaster. The Finns eventually withdrew, and Pechenga was captured. However, the Finns left behind snipers to take pot shots at the Allies as they tried to dig into the frozen ground. With the Eastern Front closed, the 40,000-strong Czechoslovak Legion found itself trapped far from the front lines of World War I. The French wanted to evacuate them from Russia to the Western Front to continue the fight against Germany. But the British had other ideas. They wanted them to stay in the case they ever got the chance to reopen the Eastern Front. Thomas Masaryk, the future president of Czechoslovakia, initially refused a proposal to have them stay in Russia. But finding a way to evacuate them out of the country proved a difficult task. Masaryk traveled to Russia in late 1918 to negotiate the Legion's departure with the Bolsheviks. It was only after Brest-Litovsk that Lenin finally agreed to let the Legion go. The Allies had intended for the Legion to depart from the northern port of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. However, this option was nullified by the presence of Finnish partisans in the area and German submarines. It was ultimately decided that the Legion would travel across Siberia to Vladivostok before setting sail to Europe. The Legion was ordered by Masaryk to assume a policy of armed neutrality, and the Bolsheviks agreed to let them carry only what they needed to defend themselves. But relations between both sides remained tense, with neither ever fully trusting the other. Nonetheless, the Legion commenced their odyssey across the vast expanses of Russia in small groups aboard trains on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Between the months of March and May, thousands of legionnaires arrived in Vladivostok. Along the way, they came across the site of Central Power POWs, including their hated Austrian oppressors, traveling west after being freed by the Bolsheviks. An even greater inconvenience was the fact that many local Soviets, going against the orders of Moscow, detained many of their trains, bombarding their troops with propaganda and trying to seize their weapons. They were also ordered by Moscow, at the last minute, to send half the Legion back west to be evacuated from Arkhangelsk, which was actually requested by the Allies without the Legion's knowledge. The impression given to the Czechoslovaks was that the Bolsheviks were planning to hand them over to the Germans. Regardless of what were to happen, the Czechoslovaks were determined to push their way to Vladivostok to continue the fight for their country's independence. This tension and distrust culminated on May 14th in the city of Chelyabinsk. As the Legion passed through the town, a physical altercation broke out between some of its troops and Hungarian POWs that left several men dead. In response, the local Soviet had the Czechoslovak troops involved arrested. Furious at such an offense, the legionaries weren't going to let the Bolsheviks boss them around. To liberate their comrades, the Legion took control of the whole city after attacking its garrison. When he received news, Trotsky was furious and ordered that all Legion trains be stopped and that the Czechoslovaks would have to choose between joining the Red Army or being conscripted into forced labor battalions. On May 22nd, the Czechoslovaks responded with a firm no. 3 days later, Trotsky sent a final and fatal order to disarm the Legion and to execute those who resisted. Any Czech that is seen armed on the rail line must be shot on sight. All local military commissariats must execute this order immediately. A lesson was certainly taught, just not in the way Trotsky expected. As soon as they heard of the order, the Czechoslovak Legion was in full revolt. Along the Trans-Siberian Railway, city after city fell to the Legion. Aside from their discipline, the Legion was also gifted with some competent commanders, such as the charismatic and brilliant Colonel Radula Gadja. With help from General Deterex and his Kalmykov Cossacks, the Legion marched upon the far eastern city of Irkutsk. The city was defended by an unimpressive force of Bolshevik troops. However, the Bolsheviks were aided by German and Austro-Hungarian POWs, who helped crush an officers' uprising prior to the city's eventual fall to Colonel Gadja. Irkutsk had also been the main Bolshevik garrison around Lake Baikal, and its fall allowed the Cossacks of Sergei Semyonov to consolidate their control over the area. The 15,000 Czechoslovaks in Vladivostok seized the city after surrounding the Bolshevik headquarters and taking them prisoner without bloodshed. Having taken so much territory, Masaryk began to reconsider the role of the Legion in Russia. Its presence there was of great value for the anti-Bolshevik cause and could be used as a bargaining chip for the recognition of an independent Czechoslovakia. It also gave the Allies a justification for further intervention. Almost immediately, the Allies, who already had ships in the harbor, landed a small contingent of soldiers in Vladivostok. Some were even sent as far as Irkutsk. Amongst their justifications were calls for humanitarian missions, but also to assist the Legion in wiping out the last pockets of Bolshevik resistance around Lake Baikal and to secure the Trans-Siberian east of Irkutsk. The Americans and the Japanese agreed to land 7,000 soldiers each, but by August, the Japanese had 72,000 men, and the Americans landed an additional 9,000, commanded by General Otani Kukuzo and General William Graves, respectively. Unfortunately, however, an unintended consequence of the Czechoslovak revolt was the execution of Tsar Nicholas and his whole family in Yekaterinburg. Whether or not the decision was taken by Lenin or the local Bolsheviks is heavily debated. Regardless, it was just one execution in thousands that the Bolsheviks had, or were going to, commit during what is known as the Red Terror. More significantly was that the revolt created a power vacuum that was quickly taken advantage of by anti-Bolshevik forces. What followed was a so-called democratic counter-revolution that saw various anti-Bolshevik groups try to form their own somewhat democratic governments. On June 8th, the SRs of the right took control of the city of Samara after gaining the support of the Czechoslovak Legion. Considering that many of the legionnaires were themselves socialists, they were quite sympathetic to their cause. The SRs then proclaimed the Committee of Members of the Constituent Assembly, or Komuch for short. On June 23rd, further east in the city of Omsk was formed the Provisional Government of Siberia, with much more influence from the KPD, Siberian regionalists, and the political right, though some socialists were involved. These were the two main contestants for control of Siberia. Despite having the same enemy, relations between Samara and Omsk were always tense, with both sides engaging in a dispute over control of the Urals and imposed tariffs on each other. The Omsk government was arguably the strongest of the two. They had been blessed with the support of the newly created Siberian army of 38,000 troops, made up of the remnants of the Russian Army's West Siberian military district and contingents of Siberian Cossacks. Komuch, on the other hand, was forced to fight with scraps. They created the People's Army, led by Colonel Vladimir Kapel, and made a call for volunteers. Kapel was a rarity amongst white officers, being that he was both competent and respected by his men. During World War I, he rose through the ranks and learned a great deal of military strategy. The problem didn't lie with him, more so the situation he found himself in. Between May and June, the People's Army recruited a mere 10,000 men and had to resort to conscription, raising a further 3,000 recruits. The People's Army was faced with many great difficulties. Firstly, equipment was scarce, with many recruits having to be sent back home for the lack of supplies, and many of those who were sent into battle were armed only with sticks. What equipment they managed to capture took too long to distribute before the Bolsheviks counterattacked. Secondly, Komuch failed to rally support to their cause. The peasantry, which had been the main basis of support for the socialist revolutionaries, were tired of war, and since the Bolsheviks had already implemented a land reform, they saw no reason to fight against Moscow. The socialist nature of Komuch also didn't help win over the educated classes, and the counter-revolutionary officers preferred to serve Omsk rather than Samara. Komuch tried to find the middle ground between socialist reform and allying themselves for the bourgeois, but failed to appease either. Komuch entered the civil war with the bare minimum, a small and ill-equipped army, little support from the populace, and an enemy that had been preparing itself for this very moment over the course of several months. Despite the odds being against them, they would still prove they were the opponent to the triumphant march of Soviet power. After the death of Kornilov, the survivors of the Ice March, numbering a measly 9,000, once again marched against the Red Army in the Kuban. General Alexeyev and others had tried to convince Denikin to head north towards Samara to link up with the Czechoslovaks, but Denikin remained firm in his decision. If the volunteers wanted to defeat the Bolsheviks, they would need to secure their rear, and the Cossacks could provide them with a steady base of support. On the 23rd of June, the order was given to push towards the regional capital of Ekaterinodar. The volunteers successfully combined cavalry and infantry attacks against the much larger Red Army, capturing dozens of towns along the rail line connecting Rostov to Belaglina. On July 15th, during the Battle of Tikhoretskaya, 30,000 Red Army soldiers were crushed, severing an important rail line and opening the way to Ekaterinodar. Tragically for the Whites was the loss of General Markov, one of their most prominent leaders at the time. On August 15th, they entered the Kuban's capital, and on the 26th, captured the port of Novorossiysk, allowing for new recruits from Crimea, amongst them General Peter Wrangel, to join the volunteers. The Kuban Cossacks, who made up 45% of the population, had been hostile to the Bolsheviks and welcomed the volunteers as liberators, joining their cause in bulk. By September, Denikin's forces had swelled to between 35,000 and 40,000 troops, hardened by battle and with a strong military tradition. Further south, the Cossacks of the Terek staged their own uprising against the Bolsheviks, forming insurgent militias that wreaked havoc in the countryside. They successfully cut the line leading southeast to the Caspian, severely disrupting Bolshevik authority in the area and confining them to a few towns. The only effective Bolshevik unit left in the region was the Taman Red Army, numbering 30,000 men. They were trapped behind enemy lines, and between August and September had to carry out a 300-mile retreat, successfully maneuvering around the White forces. While the decision to not move north was heavily criticized, it was arguably the correct one, allowing for the volunteers to increase in strength and secure the rear of the Don Cossacks. Heading back a few months, on July 4th, the 5th Congress of All Russian Soviets gathered for the first time in Moscow's Bolshoi Theater in an atmosphere of tension and agitation. The election of its delegates was characterized by widespread electoral fraud and intimidation on behalf of the Bolsheviks. The socialist revolutionaries of the left only grew more dissatisfied with the Bolsheviks after signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Left SR delegates interrupted the session with shouts of protest against the Bolsheviks. Down with Brest, down with Mirbach, down with the German servants. Even with Trotsky threatening to have the dissenters arrested, the left SRs wouldn't back down. This anti-German sentiment, and to an extent, anti-Bolshevik sentiment, had reached a boiling point that would ruin relations between the two main Marxist parties. On July 6th, Yakov Blumkin and Nicholas Andreev, two members of the Cheka who were also socialist revolutionaries, arrived at the German embassy and requested to see Ambassador Mirbach, only to fatally shoot the man before making their escape. The Germans demanded that Lenin explain to them what happened, and he personally had to attend the embassy, only being able to promise that the perpetrators would be punished. With the information gathered from the Germans, Dzerzhinsky, the head of the Cheka, put the pieces together and found out that it was his own men that committed the assassination. He worriedly went to the Cheka's combat detachment's barracks to arrest Blumkin and Andreev, only for his troops to arrest him instead. Maria Spiridonova, the leader of the left SRs, and her colleagues had done more than just plot an assassination. They had planned for a whole uprising in the heart of Bolshevik Russia. The SR Chekist, Dmitry Popov, was responsible for planning the assassination and for the subsequent uprising that was to follow. When he heard of Dzerzhinsky's capture, Lenin was shocked by fear. With him at the time, General Bonch-Bruevich recalls that Lenin was so nervous that he didn't go pale, he turned white. The following day, 2,000 well-armed troops loyal to the left SRs rose up in Moscow and quickly seized many key locations, catching the Bolsheviks unprepared. Spiridonova and her troops stormed the Bolshoi Theater, all the while the city's garrison stood by and watched. The left SRs could have easily overthrown Lenin had it not been for their own incompetence. The objective of the revolt wasn't to seize power, but to provoke Germany and mobilize the masses of Russia for revolutionary war. This whole thing was but a protest to intimidate Lenin. While Spiridonova was undeniably tough, she certainly wasn't smart. Colonel Vatsitis rallied a force of 3,300 men, mostly Latvians, and pushed back the left SRs in a bitter fight to retake the city. After 7 long hours, Brzezinski had been freed, and Moscow was back in their hands. As all this was unraveling, there was another revolt further north in the city of Yaroslavl. The Union for the Defense of the Motherland and Freedom, headed by Boris Savinkov, had been promised support from a French landing that was supposed to take place in Arkhangelsk. On July 6th, 6,000 men, commanded by Colonel Alexander Perkhudov, rose up and took control of the city. The uprising was beset with problems from the start. The rebels were critically short on weapons. While the local workers had managed to improvise an armored train for them, it wasn't enough to defeat the Bolsheviks. On the night of the 9th, the Red Army attempted to retake the city, but were held off by the rebels. Curiously, a unit of Chinese soldiers were amongst the attackers. Not having much luck, the Reds resorted to an artillery bombardment to weaken their defenses, and managed to destroy the city's water supply. After over a week of fighting, Trotsky dispatched a former Tsarist officer, Anatoly Gekker, to take command of the assault. He attacked with infantry, artillery, and even aircraft, with devastating consequences. The rebels had already been suffering from dehydration, and finally gave up on their rebellion. On the 20th, they surrendered to the Germans, who were there to repatriate Central Power POWs. The Germans promised them that they would ensure their safety by not handing them over to the Reds. Finally, on the 21st, they surrendered their weapons, and Yaroslavl was briefly occupied by released German POWs. Lenin kept good on his promise that the perpetrators would suffer. The failed revolt was followed by a wave of repression against the left SRs. 650 of them were arrested in cities such as Moscow and Petrograd, and another 200 were executed. The Yaroslavl rebels were betrayed by the Germans after the Bolsheviks demanded that they be handed over. During the night of the 21st, 300 of them were rounded up and executed. The Bolsheviks went even further and detained many former officers who had taken no part in the uprising, with many of them being executed without trial. Spiridonova was, for the time, spared from death, being detained in the Kremlin as she awaited her trial. She was sentenced to a year in prison, only to be immediately pardoned and set free. But her freedom wouldn't last long, as she would spend the rest of her life in and out of prison. She was executed in 1941 by the NKVD during the German invasion. The assassination of Count Mirbach presented the Germans with an excellent opportunity to squeeze out more concessions from the vulnerable Bolsheviks. General Ludendorff wanted nothing more than to finish off Russia and rid themselves of Lenin's regime, replacing it with a conservative government loyal to Germany. The problem he faced was that most of Russia's conservatives absolutely despised the Germans, and the political capital back home needed for a deeper push into Russia was insufficient. For the meantime, the Bolsheviks would have to do. In August, an additional treaty was signed between the two parties. In exchange for German protection, Bolshevik Russia was to recognize the loss of their western territories and pay a sum of 6 billion Reichsmarks. The only saving grace for Lenin was that he no longer had to worry about defending his western border, allowing the Red Army to redirect troops to other more important fronts. In addition, the Germans supplied the Bolsheviks with 200,000 rifles, 500 million rounds of ammunition, and 70 tons of coal, much needed for if the Russian Revolution was to survive. With the People's Army and Czechoslovak Legion threatening Kazan and cutting the Volga River in two, Mikhail Muraviev was trusted with command of Eastern Army Group. Having served loyally against the Ukrainian Rada, Lenin thought he could trust him to hold the line. Militarily speaking, the quality of Red forces on the Volga was rather pathetic, as the troops were demoralized and ill-equipped for the task at hand. It was perhaps expected of Muraviev to make do and crush Lenin's enemies as he had done before. But there is one key detail about the man that I've yet to mention, and that is that he was a socialist revolutionary of the left. Muraviev was greatly offended at the peace deal with the Germans, and certainly was sympathetic towards Spiridonova and her cause. On July 10th, Muraviev and 1,000 of his men mutinied against the Bolsheviks. They sailed down the Volga from Kazan to Simbirsk and even tried to convince the Czechoslovaks to join them in a march towards the west. It was only thanks to the quick reaction of the Bolshevik chairman of Simbirsk, a young Latvian named Veriekis, that the mutiny was crushed. Veriekis laid a successful ambush that destroyed the rebels in one swift move, resulting in the death of Muraviev. The forces of Kumwich and their Czechoslovak allies were now on the move, sweeping away what little Red Army forces stood against them. On July 21st, after traveling 140 kilometers to Simbirsk, Lenin's home city, the Legion and the People's Army, numbering 1,500 troops, captured the city along with large supplies of weapons. The Red Army was in shambles, and Colonel Vatsitis ordered Fyodor Raskolnikov, accompanied by his wife Larisa Rezner, to sail down the Volga from Nizhny Novgorod with a fleet of light cruisers and armed riverboats to reinforce the Red Army forces further south. Capel managed to assemble his own flotilla of 6 steamers and used it for his assault on Kazan. With only 2,500 soldiers, his forces successfully landed in the city, but were initially forced to fall back due to heavy resistance and exhaustion. Kazan was defended by a regiment of Latvians and an international battalion of Serbians, and several armored cars. Colonel Vatsitis had personally traveled to Kazan to take command of the city's defense, and planned to use his Latvian riflemen and 5th Red Army to spearhead a counterattack. Capel's next attack struck the following day, and was much more successful. The Serbian battalion defected during the fighting along with part of Vatsitis' staff, then took pot shots at their former commander. After enduring such a humiliation, Vatsitis was saved by his trusty Latvians and was evacuated out of the city. He later complained to Moscow that the units in Kazan turned out to be completely useless as a result of their poor training and indiscipline, which just goes to show that the Red Army had yet to become a proper fighting force. By August 8th, Kazan had been taken by Capel and his allies. Aside from weapons and other necessities, they also managed to capture 645 million in gold, almost half of Russia's reserve. 2 days later, the workers of Izvestfotinsk revolted against the Bolsheviks and declared their loyalty to Komuch. It was the largest workers' uprising ever against the Bolsheviks and was a massive embarrassment for Lenin. The Izvestfotinsk revolt extended beyond the city into the countryside, posing a serious threat to the rear of the Red Army. But Capel was unable to capitalize on the revolt. Simply due to the distance, there was no way of supporting the rebels, and Komuch paid little attention. By November 9th, the revolt had been crushed. Thousands of refugees fled east, later joining the Whites in Siberia. The People's Army was stretched thin, losing the initiative and failing to rally support in the captured territory. The Red Army, on the other hand, dug in and held off Komuch forces and began to receive reinforcements. Most of the Red Army was still in the west in case hostilities with the Central Powers reignited. But with their defeat in World War I seemingly inevitable, Lenin ordered that all battle-worthy units be transferred to Eastern Army Group. By September 15th, Red forces on the Volga had grown from 53,000 to 70,000 by June 21st, and later to 103,000 in October. Amongst these units were the ever-so-reliable Latvian riflemen, and even 4 destroyers from the Baltic fleet that were sailed down the Volga. Trotsky himself ventured out with them, bringing along 200 communist volunteers from Petrograd on his famous armored train. Aside from men, he also brought with him weapons, vehicles, and other much-needed supplies for if the campaign was to be successful. 4 armies were deployed along the front facing Komuch. 3rd Army, commanded by the Latvian Reingold Berzin, was holding the line in the Urals. 4th Army was slowly advancing towards Saratov. 1st Army, commanded by the talented and politically insane Mikhail Tuashevsky, was pushing towards Sibirsk. 5th Army, commanded by another Latvian rifleman, Colonel Slavin, was the most important, advancing towards Kazan itself. 3rd Army was ordered by Vatsitis and Trotsky to advance along the rail line connecting Perm to Yekaterinburg. But the tracks were destroyed by retreating Komuch forces, and the Baltic sailors, weakened by the Z's, were fearful of an enemy counterattack. After reaching Perm, they straight up refused to advance and approved the resolution to return to Petrograd. Berzin tried to get them to stay, but all he managed to do was convince them to serve as blocking detachments behind the front line. Trying to convince their soldiers to stay and fight proved a difficult task, and a rout was only avoided because of Trotsky's firm leadership. Trying to retake the initiative, Capel launched a counterattack in late August to capture the Romanov Bridge just west of Kazan. The People's Army had been reinforced by reserve units, but their total strength only numbered 2,000 troops, many of which were exhausted and poorly trained. But if they succeeded, they could penetrate deep into enemy territory and cut the 5th Army in two. The initial attack hit the Red Army hard, and panic took over. Only 500 out of 10,000 soldiers in the area held their ground, with the rest either running away or trying to board the few riverboats at their disposal. At one point, the only unit holding back Capel was Trotsky's personal train and bodyguards. It was then that the men of the 5th Army learned that Trotsky's firm leadership consisted of more than just speeches. He ordered that deserters be executed, and dozens were killed to reaffirm discipline. The battle for the bridge was hard fought, and the Red Army eventually succeeded in holding back the People's Army. Short on ammo and exhausted from the fighting, Capel and his Czechoslovak allies were forced to withdraw, and on September 10th, Slavin's 5th Army triumphantly entered Kazan. 2 days later, Tukhachevsky's 1st Army was itself victorious in its capture of Sibirsk. The noose was tightening around Komuch's neck, and it wouldn't take long for the death sentence to be carried out. Raskolnikov and Reisner continued down the Volga towards the mouth of the Kama River. They were confronted with what remained of the People's Army's flotilla. The Red Flotilla was much better armed compared to the improvised river boats of their enemies, but struggled in the shallower waters of the Kama. Yet, they still managed to disembark troops in the town of Chistopil and successfully captured it. On October 7th, the 4th Army entered the capital of Samara, and Komuch was officially dissolved. Kappel and what remained of the People's Army retreated eastwards, while the rest deserted, joining the Bolsheviks or simply going home. For his accomplishments, Colonel Vatsitis was rewarded with the position of Commander-in-Chief of the whole Red Army. He also dodged a literal bullet, as Lenin had ordered that he be executed if the Volga campaign failed. Even though he played a major role in organizing the Red Army, von Breuerwitsch was replaced, supposedly for ill health. Aside from the People's Army, the Czechoslovak Legion suffered its first major defeat, and the morale of its troops plummeted. The campaign against Komich was the baptism of fire for the Red Army. No longer a force of disorganized militia, it had proven that a regular army was necessary to stem the tide of counter-revolution. To quote historian Evan Maudsley, the Volga campaign stimulated the Red Army's development in a way that early fighting in the Don and the Ukraine and in the 11 Days War against the Central Powers had not. The Volga campaign, difficult though it was at times, was an inoculation, a relatively mild form of counter-revolution, which prepared the Reds for what was to come. Without it, they might have perished, unprepared in the much more lethal campaign of 1919. By the end of May, a further 970 Allied troops had landed in Murmansk to reinforce the minuscule British garrison. Interestingly, the forces in Murmansk were also joined by Finnish communists fleeing from the victorious Whites and even Karelian separatists, adding a further 1,400 troops to the garrison. This was the start of an even greater effort by the Allies to not just hold back the Central Powers, but to build an anti-Bolshevik army in the northern tundra. General Frederick Poole of the UK was sent to the port of Arkhangelsk and arrived on August 2nd. Prior to his arrival, the British had been in contact with Tsarist officers led by Grigory Chaplin, who ousted the local Soviets in a coup the same day as Poole's arrival. Interestingly, the new Northern Region government was headed by the veteran Social Democrat Nikolai Tchaikovsky and other delegates of the Constituent Assembly. Unsurprisingly, conflict emerged between Chaplin's officers and Tchaikovsky's SRs. Poole himself attempted to rule Arkhangelsk as a dictator, imposing upon martial law and crushing political dissent. These tensions reached a boiling point in early September, when Chaplin, presumably with help from Poole, overthrew Tchaikovsky's government and imprisoned him in a monastery. Chaplin's coup was heavily scrutinized by the governments of the interventionists, especially the Americans. Tchaikovsky was brought back, and the Americans threatened that if something like this ever happened again, they would withdraw from northern Russia. Trotsky, who ironically approved of the initial landings, ordered that Alexei Yuriev expel the British from Murmansk. But since there was no one else defending the port from the Finns, Yuriev told him that it wasn't possible. On June 28th, Lenin personally threatened him. "If you still refuse to understand Soviet policy, you have only yourself to blame." Yuriev snapped back. "It's all very well for you to talk like that, sitting in Moscow." That was the last straw for Lenin, and Yuriev was labeled a traitor, and the rail line to Murmansk was cut. Even if the Murmansk Soviet wanted to, they were simply too weak to oust the British, and the lack of support from Moscow only facilitated the foreign takeover. By September, General Poole had a mixed force of American, British, French, and Serbian troops, totaling 8,470 men. The Allies initially intended for the Czechoslovaks to link up with them and to raise a new army of 30,000 local Russians. But this plan was quickly proven unrealistic. Poole wasn't content with sitting around and doing nothing. He planned an offensive to take the cities of Vologda and Vietka. His forces were to advance along 4 fronts: along the railway line, the Dvina River, and 2 of its tributaries, the Vaga and the Penega rivers, and toward the port of Onega. The trip to the front line lasted several days, and it wouldn't be until September 20th that they were faced with proper resistance in the village of Seltso. There, the Red Army was equipped with artillery and subjected the Allies to a heavy bombardment. American troops rushed the enemy's positions with fixed bayonets, to little effect, and the front line around the village became bogged down. As the Vaga and Upper Dvina were taken, they were confronted by an improvised Red Army train along the rail line. The impenetrable forest and the lack of roads made the rail line crucial to their offensive, and the Allies responded by improvising their own armored train, equipped with artillery and machine guns. It was completed on August 22nd, and was quickly put into action. Advancing down the tracks on a reconnaissance mission, its crew soon spotted an enemy train further down. After some preparations, the Allies attacked on the 31st, and the 2 war machines engaged in a duel not too far from each other. Bolshevik troops that had dismounted and taken up defensive positions were outflanked by French soldiers, causing them to flee. For the next 7 days, the Red Army withdrew, tearing up tracks and destroying bridges, in a futile attempt to stop the Allies from taking the village of Oretskaya. While clearly having the upper hand, the Allied advance came to a standstill, and their troops were ordered to dig in. Back in September, the American government had even requested that the expedition in northern Russia be focused on protecting the ports rather than taking the offensive. But this didn't mean that the fighting was over. Far from it. Allied troops defending the village of Tulgas were set upon by a Bolshevik counterattack in late October that was only routed after the Americans launched a successful counterattack. They too were ordered to dig in preparation for the harsh Russian winter. It wouldn't take long for the Bolsheviks to retry their luck at pushing the interventionists back to the sea. After his election as Ataman of the Don Cossacks, Krasnov governed with an iron fist and wasted no time in organizing an army. By the middle of June, the Don army had a force of 40,000 men, equipped with machine guns and artillery. Krasnov managed to convince the war-weary Cossacks that liberating the Don wasn't enough, that they'd have to create a buffer zone around them. With their rear secured by the Nikin and the Germans giving their support, the Cossacks launched an offensive to finish off the remnants of the Red Army in southern Russia. They advanced in two directions, towards the city of Voronezh and Tsaritsyn. The attack on Tsaritsyn was headed by the talented cavalryman Konstantin Mamontov. The Cossacks were well suited for fighting on the steppes of Russia, but trying to take a city proved much more difficult. Defending the city was a 9th Red Army. Its commander was technically Clement Voroshilov, but in reality, it was Joseph Stalin. He'd been sent there in May to oversee the supply of food in the region, but defied orders from Moscow and began working alongside Voroshilov in its defense. Mamontov's first attack commenced in August, but was frustrated by the Red Army. In September, a second attack was launched, and by October, the Cossacks had nearly surrounded the city. However, the defenders of Tsaritsyn retook the initiative and pushed the Cossacks back to the frontiers of the Don. While the Cossacks failed to take Tsaritsyn, the vital railway that connected the remnants of the Red Army in the North Caucasus was cut off, which was to have dire consequences. It was also during this battle that Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin butt heads in a serious dispute. The Red Army was still undergoing a process of reorganization. Trotsky and Vasitis were trying to bring the Red Army under a central command, and had appointed a former Tsarist officer named General Sitin as commander of the Red Forces in Tsaritsyn. But Stalin and Voroshilov protested this decision. Sitin was eventually transferred to Moscow, Stalin joined the Revolutionary Military Council, and Voroshilov remained in control of the troops in Tsaritsyn, now a part of the 10th Red Army. What became known as the Tsaritsyn affair was to have severe consequences between the relations of these two men. Further south, the volunteers and the Kuban Cossacks were making quick work of the weakened Red Army. The newly arrived Peter Vangel was himself a talented commander, and his cavalry of Kuban Cossacks fought a series of grueling battles against the Red Army, and, on November 15th, captured the city of Stavropol. White casualties were high, numbering up to 30,000, including the deceased General Drovdovsky. While not killed in combat, General Alexeyev himself died of cancer, leaving the entirety of the White movement in South Russia under the command of General Anton Denikin. With Tsaritsyn under siege, the 11th Red Army, numbering 120,000 men, was completely isolated and disintegrated, with most of its men fading away into the steppes of Kalmykia and only a few thousand escaping to the port of Astrakhan on the mouth of the Volga. Denikin's victory secured the Kuban and pushed the Red Army deeper into the Caucasus, where they were continuously harassed by the talented and charismatic Andrei Shukro, who was able to recruit plenty of Cossacks to its cause, helping increase the number of Denikin's men to almost 40,000. The success of the volunteer army contrasted with the defeat suffered by Krasnov's forces. His troops were limited and still unwilling to fight outside of the Don. Eventually, the Bolsheviks started to push them back towards their homeland. With Komach defeated, the Bolsheviks prioritized the southern front and started redeploying units from Eastern Army Group to the south. Worse yet, many Don Cossacks began to desert, returning home or joining the Bolsheviks. At its peak in November, the Don army had around 50,000 soldiers, but in January 1919, that number dropped to only 15,000. This greatly changed the dynamic between Denikin and Krasnov. If the Don was to survive, they would have to submit themselves to the Nikin, just as the Kuban and the Terek had. But this was made harder by the fact that the Don Cossacks wanted greater autonomy in contrast to the volunteers, who wanted a unified Russia, one and indivisible. Krasnov's alliance with the Germans had also strained relations with the volunteers, but with Germany's defeat on the horizon, he was about to lose a crucial ally against the Bolsheviks. Even Denikin needed as much help as he could get if he were to be victorious, and both sides would be forced to compromise if they were to survive. With the remnants of Komach on the back foot, the Omsk Directory was clearly the strongest faction in Siberia. Yet, that didn't stop the Socialist Revolutionaries from challenging their authority. In September, 200 representatives from the Samara and Omsk governments were under pressure from the Allies to come to an agreement met in the city of Ufa. The result was a merger between the two factions, forming the All-Russian Provisional Government ruled by a directory of 5 men, 2 being cadets, 2 being SRs, and the 5th member being General Vasily Bolyrev, the new commander-in-chief of their army, who was also sympathetic to the Socialist Revolutionaries. On paper, the socialist revolutionaries were the most powerful, but the reality was very different. After the fall of Samara, the position of the SRs weakened severely, and the political right grew stronger. Worst of all, this new government was barely even a government to begin with. For starters, they had to operate out of a railway car just a few kilometers from Omsk and lacked proper institutions and bureaucracy to even finance their activities. Most concerning was that the Siberian army, now dominated by right-wing officers, showed little respect for their authority. In one such display of insubordination, drunken officers crashed a banquet, embarrassing the whole government in front of British diplomats. The image that the old Russian government projected was one of weakness and inefficiency. Both the left and the right, believing the government gave more power to the other side, had little confidence and began to conspire against it. Omsk became riddled with secret plots and rumors of coups. In the words of General Bolivarev, Omsk was a Mexico in the middle of the snow and ice. Despite its shortcomings, the all-Russian government tried immensely hard to get the Allies to officially recognize it as the legal government of Russia. In Britain, it was heavily debated on whether or not they were worth backing. The War Office had little faith, wanting instead a military dictator to set Russia on the right course. The Foreign Office held the opposite position. Since many of its members were elected to the Constituent Assembly, it gave them proper legitimacy. Ultimately, it was the Foreign Office that won out, and the All-Russian Provisional Government was to be officially recognized. Well, at least, that was what was supposed to happen. Not long before, the commander of the British military mission in Siberia arrived in Vladivostok. General Alfred Knox was an ardent anti-communist and strongly opposed propositions of negotiating with Lenin. He also served in the British embassy in Petrograd, having at least some knowledge of the country, and most certainly had his own ideas on how things should be done. Another arrival was Alexander Kolchak, the former admiral of the Black Sea Fleet. Before the Bolshevik takeover, he was on a mission to Washington and later to Tokyo, where he got in contact with the British. He met General Knox, who took a liking to him, calling him the best Russian for our purpose in the Far East. By November, Kolchak was in Omsk, serving as the all-Russian government's Minister of War. With the Red Army slowly advancing across the Urals, the political right believed it time for someone else to be in charge. On November 18th, a bloodless coup ousted the all-Russian government from power. With no one coming to their defense, the ministers simply accepted their fate, and in the case of the SRs, were detained and forced into exile. A military dictatorship was established, with Admiral Kolchak at its head, bearing the title of Supreme Ruler, promising to restore order and the establishment of a Russia, one and indivisible. Kolchak's involvement in the coup had been almost accidental, and was initially just used as a figurehead for the new government. In fact, he had originally declined to support the coup, only accepting power once the government had been ousted as to prevent Siberia from descending into chaos. As for the Allies, there is no evidence of direct involvement. In fact, they were largely against it. However, General Knox, at the very least, knew about the plot and did nothing to prevent it. Kolchak couldn't have been brought to power at a better time, as the Russian Civil War was about to enter a new and decisive phase. A few days prior, on November 11th, Germany was finally defeated, signing an armistice with the victorious Entente. After 4 years of fighting, the guns on the Western Front fell silent. But not everywhere did soldiers get to rejoice in the tranquility of peace. That very same day, in the Russian far north, Red Army guns pounded the American defenders of Tulga from dusk till dawn. The Red Infantry charged the Americans' positions. Despite failing, the Bolsheviks left behind 14 US soldiers dead and wouldn't stop till victory had been achieved. The Central Powers were forced to withdraw from all the territory they had occupied after Brest-Litovsk. This brought forth new opportunities for the Whites and the Reds to conquer much-needed resources for their war effort. The Bolsheviks were first to strike west into Ukraine. Antonov Ovseyenko finally got the chance to retake everything he had lost earlier that year, and by November 26 had already captured several towns close to the Russian border, and soon to advance towards the important city of Kyiv. But the Reds weren't the only ones interested in Ukraine. That same month, units of the Volunteer Army and of the Kuban Cossacks, led by the talented General Maimayevsky and Andrei Shukro, advanced into the Donbass, facing off against a new contestant in the Russian Civil War, the anarchist Ukrainian insurgent army of Nestor Makhno. The Red Army saw initial success in the Baltic states, but were stopped by the various nationalist armies that had sprouted after Germany's withdrawal. More alarming was the presence of a growing White Russian army based in Estonia. The Skull Volunteer Corps had been founded back in September under German supervision. By November, it only had 4,500 men, but given its proximity to Petrograd and its alliance with the Estonians, it made it a serious threat. Kolchak was readying his forces for what was to be the decisive phase of the Civil War. The 15,000 rebellious workers from Izvest and Votinsk had managed to join up with Kolchak, and another 15,000 from Kapel's People's Army also joined his forces. The Siberian army, now numbering some 40,000 men, was even conducting a small offensive, capturing the city of Perm and destroying the Red Third Army. These units formed the foundation of Kolchak's new Russian army, and more men were called to serve in its ranks. The recent success in Perm filled Kolchak and his supporters with optimism, but while Kolchak drew up plans to make Russia one and indivisible, the Bolsheviks were more than ready to contest his dreams of restoring the Russian Empire. After a long journey of trial and error, of victory and defeat, the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army was far from the disorganized mob it had once been. Now, with a proper command structure and discipline, the Red Army, hardened by the Volga campaign, had grown to an enormous force of 800,000 by the start of 1919 and would continue to swell with new recruits. The Russian Civil War was far from over, and it was still too soon to judge who'd come out on top. It wasn't just Russia at play here. The future of the whole world lied in the balance. Whoever win could change the world forever and leave their mark on history.